As you can imagine, people were saying, what's going on? These gangsters, you just paraded them through the streets, you put them in prison, and now you're letting them out. Explain yourselves. You would think that the result would be someone would got fired. Well, what happened was Tom Clark
He was talking about this. He's like, the second you it's part of the communist agenda. Second, you demoralize society, especially sexually. Sexually, like you expose children and all that. Members of society won't be able to make.
Hey guys, this is the Millennial's Choice Show. We have a really special guest for you here today. This is another series in our Chicago adventure. We are here with one of the best criminal defense lawyers in Chicago. We have our guy. He is a certified mobologist, Mr. Paul Whitcombe. What's going on?
It's good to see you both. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate that. Maybe a bit of an exaggeration, but I appreciate it.
Paul, it's so nice to meet you in person. We had a really, really good talk online recently, and for those of you guys that haven't watched it, make sure to check out part 1. This is part 2, but we're live here in the Windy City.
We left our families behind. They don't need us. We left our wives behind. They definitely don't need us. And we are here in Chicago, investing in the podcast and meeting great people. So thanks for coming back on.
It's a pleasure, and I have to say my wife definitely does need me because she's home cleaning the house while I'm spending the afternoon with you gentlemen.
There you go.
Thank
Oh
you.
my God, we definitely owe you one.
We know our wives need us. We know they need us. But what's happening in your world?
It seems like the world has gone a little bit crazy, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah.
Not only personally, I went from being a young and vivacious middle-aged guy to a grandfather of 3 in 1 year, and I'm still adjusting to that. No one asked my permission to make me a grandfather. They just did it.
Did they have triplets?
No, I actually have 5 kids, but 2 of them decided to have 3 children in 1 year.
Wow, that's awesome.
So now I'm a grandfatherly figure.
Very wise grandfather.
We're working on the wise part.
We made my parents grandparents as well. And then we had one, my son, he was 11 months. My daughter was born, so 2 under 1. And now it's 2 under 2.
Oh, boy.
And Danny had his son. He's turning 1 soon.
Yes, very soon.
Yeah.
Oh, boy. Christmas
Busy
is going to
time.
be fun for you guys.
Oh, yeah. Especially for Matthew.
Yeah, I'm excited. You know, it's like for me, now that I have kids, I can't, like you can't unhave them, but in the sense of it, you can't undo who it made you now, if that makes sense. I don't know if I'm stumbling on my words a little bit, but like you get wired differently as a man.
You do, and you finally understand what your father meant when he said, this hurts me more than it hurts you.
Yeah.
I always thought that was a line of crap, but now I understand it. He's right. It really does.
Your perspective is so different, honestly, now. Like, you know, it's easy to say, you know, I get what my parents, you know, are going through, but until you're in their shoes, you'll never really fully understand, you know. We can comprehend or apprehend it, but you won't really fully comprehend it until you're filling their shoes, right? And so it's such a blessing to be a dad, and, you know, it's especially probably even better blessing being a granddad. So yeah, we look forward to that day.
So far, it's pretty good. You get all of the fun, but none of the responsibility.
That's what I was gonna say.
That's huge.
No diaper changes. No, maybe you watch them here and there, but otherwise, it's like I always say, it's like when you bring your dog over, we can play around with her, have some fun. She ain't my problem when I leave.
100%
That's your problem.
True. 100% true.
But you know, one last about the kids, like one thing that really, so 2 things. Number 1, I just look at my son and I go, like, one day I'm going to have to discipline you. You know, when he starts to really get it. And that's a whole nother thing. And the second thing is, like, I'm 33 and I'm like, if my dad, like the love we have for our kids, if my dad ever came up to me now and tried to pick me up and kiss the back of my neck or something, I'm like, what the heck are you doing, weirdo? Like, it's my dad. But I do that with my son now, and I'm like, I'm already missing the days where I'll miss those days. It's coming to an end eventually, but I'm going to miss those days, man.
Well, the best is still ahead because the golden years are from 2 to 5, where they're old enough to communicate with you, but young enough so that you are the most important thing in the world. So treasure those 3 years
Yeah.
because once they're gone, those will never come back.
Yeah.
Wow,
And
that's huge.
from our first recording together, you have a very diverse and unique background. Like you've seen what we talk about with some of these guests that we have on the show, but from a completely different perspective. And then the doors have opened and you guys are creating content about it. And I love it. And you said it on another episode where kind of New York gets the spotlight,
Right.
but Chicago was on a different level completely. And we want to get to know a little bit more about that perspective. So can you share some insights on some stuff that we haven't heard or our audience hasn't heard about the Chicago outfit? Like anything that stands out, some sort of memory or something you've heard of, a story that really stands out in your mind that took place because of the Chicago outfit?
Oh, I'd be happy to. There were so many to pick from. But one of my favorites is one that almost no one knows about. And of course, Chicago, you don't see much in the movies. You hear about Al Capone, and anywhere you go in the world, if they ask you where you're from Chicago, they say, oh, bang, bang, Al Capone. But that's it.
Yeah.
And they thought once they got Capone, that largely in the public consciousness, that's all there is. But Chicago not only went on beyond Capone, but flourished and grew to become the most powerful criminal organization on the face of the planet. And during the 1930s, they decided that they would infiltrate Hollywood, the movie-making business, which up until that time was centered really in New York City. And as it moved out to Hollywood, Chicago got involved, infiltrated the labor unions. They had an IATSE meeting, the stagehands and the technicians in Tennessee. The outfit showed up in the aisle with machine guns and said, you will vote for our guy. And amazingly, he was elected unanimously. Oh, wow. So the Chicago outfit was now running Hollywood, and they used that to threaten the major heads of the studios with shutdowns and labor stoppages if they didn't give them money.
Oh, wow.
Well, that's only the beginning of the story. They
Shook down Hollywood, eh?
They shook down Hollywood, and they controlled what pictures were made, who became a star, who became a musical star. That's a whole nother story. But this story is that they got caught doing this in Hollywood because the guy that they picked to run the local union was a former pimp, and he didn't have a lot of class. So he would show up wearing $100,000 pinky rings. He bought a huge mansion. He would pay things in $100,000 worth of cash. The government eventually caught on. Something is going on. And eventually, the biggest wheels in the Chicago outfit all went to prison. Now, this was unheard of at that time for a major gangster in the 1940s to go to prison. And that left a man by the name of Tony Accardo in charge of the Chicago outfit. The bosses in prison said, Tony, your one job is to get us out of prison. Well, to make a long story short, what he did through other people was reach out to the Truman White House and the Attorney General, whose name was Tom Clark. Tom Clark released the most notorious gangsters in the country on early parole. They only served a couple of years of their sentence, and it caused a huge uproar. As you can imagine, people were saying, what's going on? These gangsters, you just paraded them through the streets, you put them in prison, and now you're letting them out. Explain yourselves. You would think that the result would be someone would got fired.
Yeah.
Well, what happened was Tom Clark was appointed to the United States Supreme Court.
Wow.
And that gives you some sense of what happened here. Now, obviously, we don't have documents to say this is the conversation that took place. But hypothetically, what would an attorney general want in exchange for something like that? He gets seated on the United States Supreme Court. And then in the 1960s, the Chicago outfit was being recorded secretly by the FBI. Much of what we know now is because of these illegally placed microphones. Well, a new attorney general was appointed who stopped that program in its tracks. He had all the microphones removed. His name was Ramsey Clark, the son of Tom Clark. And it gives you some idea of the incredible power that these people had over our country.
That's huge.
That's stuff you hear about in the movies. Like you see in the movies where It's like this guy did a favor. He exchanged favors,
Yes.
big favors.
Big favors.
Supreme Court. That's a big deal. When you said that, the first thought that ran through my mind, I was like, I was concerned. That's the Supreme Court.
That's very concerning. But
Yeah.
I have a quick question. I don't know if you could definitely give us insight. I know you can give us insight on this. Don't you think Tony Accardo had every reason not to get the former mob bosses out of jail? Because wasn't he kind of in charge on the outside?
Sure.
What are
Sure.
your thoughts on that? Yeah.
A lot of people, when they think about the Chicago outfit, they think about Tony Accardo, because from the late 30s until he died in 1992, he had incredible power. But the truth is that Tony Accardo, for all those years, shared power with a man by the name of Paul Rica. Paul the waiter, Rica, who came from Italy. He murdered a man in Italy who had dishonored his sister. And then he was convicted of that, but he went and murdered the witness against him, and then fled Italy, assumed a new name, came up through the ranks, and was really the successor to Al Capone. We hear about Frank Nitti and all those things, but the real power was Paul Rica.
Yeah.
His partner was Tony Accardo for all those years. And that's what makes Tony Accardo so interesting, is even though he had all that power, he shared it with his friend, Paul Rica. And there was never violence between them. They worked together behind the scenes very frequently. And that's why Tony Accardo got those men out, was because his best friend and his partner was Paul Rica.
Oh, makes sense.
Do you think that ties into kind of like even when we're in business, and I think you're the same way, where the handshake seals the deal for us, and obviously document everything, get it in writing. We do that afterwards. But if we're doing a deal here and we come to an agreement, we shake hands, there's a show of good faith there, and it should happen. The deal should close or whatever. Do you think that this ties back to that way of doing things where the treachery was less frequent? There was a lot of, old school principles there that they lived by, and they wouldn't cross each other for those reasons? Or do you just think they were stronger together and they knew that? Or
In other words, is there honor amongst thieves, right?
sure.
That's a great question. And a lot of people have the idea that the mafia lives by a code, the code of omerta and all those other things. But the truth is that you don't see these things written in contracts, because that would be the evidence that would send them to prison. That they did things with a handshake because that was something that couldn't be introduced in front of a jury. These were not nice people. And even though some of them did certainly care for their children, their grandchildren, their neighborhoods, they had a different set of beliefs than we do. They were criminals, and almost to a man, they were killers. So I think the idea that there is honor among thieves is probably a bit of a Hollywood creation more than it is anything else.
That makes sense.
It's interesting, yeah.
Makes sense, especially because they were in charge of Hollywood, or they were connecting. They were making sure that everything was ran by them first before it got put out there. So that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure.
In your cases, so we interview these guys, and then we ask them about this whole snitching thing and the ratting thing, and almost everyone, with the exception of a couple people we've interviewed, one who's in this room today, has not ratted or snitched or anything like that. So have you ever been on that side where you're working for the government and you guys are figuring out a way to get this person to flip, and you see how that goes down in the room? Like, have you ever been in that situation?
Yes.
So how does that play out?
My favorite story about that is that ultimately we're all human, and ultimately self-preservation is our instinct. And when I was state's attorney, which I prosecuted for a short period of time, I had caught someone with quite a bit of cocaine, and I knew that he was involved with many other people that were doing this, bringing it into our town. And I said to him, Jeffrey, if you're willing to bring me 6 others that are doing this, we're going to be able to work something out that'll be more favorable to you. And he did. And we made 6 buys. On the day of the 6th buy, he came. We were wiring him up, and that you have to take off the shirt and things like that. And he had a big bandage on his neck. And I said, "What happened? Did someone do anything to you?" And he said, "Oh no, Mr. Whitcombe, you got to see this." And he took off the bandage, and he had a tattoo on the side of his neck, and it said, "Loyalty." And I thought, the irony of that is just unbelievable. But it was totally lost on him. He didn't understand because he was just trying to keep himself out of prison. And that's why he did what he did. And one of the people he actually set up a buy from was his brother.
Wow. So he set up his own brother.
Yes.
For his own freedom.
Yes.
Essentially. Wow.
And I've come across many, many people in that life who would rather die than do that. But those that cross that line, it's self-preservation.
Well, see, that guy's brother's a snitch, not me.
You know what? You know why I call him a snitch?
for some reason.
There's one reason, and you know why. It's the guy selling the fruits and the vegetables.
Oh,
Do you remember?
of course.
So
I
my
remember.
parents owned like a 400 square foot tuck shop convenience store. That was their bread and butter. That's what, paid the bills for us for like 25 years. And then there would always be this guy who's in a van, and just before my parents' store location, he would pull up, open the van, bring out some crates of like fruits and vegetables, right? So he's charging cash. He's not paying taxes. He's not doing any of that stuff. And one day we're walking, and it would bother me too. And my dad would always go and tell him and say, "Look, you can't be here. Like, I have a business to run."
Yeah.
Right? And he's right. And then this guy would go,
I'm
I'm gonna call. The little kid calls the bylaw officer, and he goes, "Oh, this ain't sanitary. This ain't sanitary." And but my whole take on that, this is more personal, but my whole take on that is, God's been good to us. There's more to go, enough to go around. Let him do his thing. If someone else complains and comes, to stop him or whatever, fine. But don't let it be us. I've always been like that. I've never.
What if someone got sick from eating that fruit, Matthew? How would you sleep at night?
But that's not why you did it. So your intention was bad.
What do you mean?
He was protecting his family.
Yeah, there you go.
He was
a pretty good
protecting his
intention.
interests.
Well,
Which
his
is my
family.
family. Which is my family.
Yes.
So on the other side, where we hear these hard guys, like, we've interviewed Michael Francisi, and he goes, his father, Sonny Francisi, he did hard time and never cooperated, and he went down like that, and well respected in that community. But like, have you been on that side where dealing with somebody who refuses to rat on anyone or flip?
Oh, sure.
How does that what's their mindset like? How does that happen?
Well, some of them are simply not willing to do something that they consider to be the ultimate wrong. The cardinal sin is cooperating with the government. And to that extent, that code is real and that does exist. But others are simply frightened to do it. They're just, again, balancing self-interest. What is it going to cost me if I do this? And we've seen many, many people with the Chicago outfit who were suspected of or actually were cooperating who wound up blown to bits and hung from meat hooks and floating in the Bay of Biscayne and things like that. So there could be a very high cost.
And on that note, would the Chicago outfit go after their families as well too, or was it just business with those individuals that decided to maybe flip?
Well, the myth about the Chicago outfit is you don't mess with families, you don't mess with girlfriends, you don't mess with journalists, you don't mess with police. But that's not really a hard and fast rule. That rule's in place because it's more trouble than it's worth. You bring more heat. But I could give many examples of girlfriends and wives and journalists and even politicians who were killed by the outfit in order to send a message to their families.
Were women involved in the Chicago outfit at all?
Sure, Virginia Hill was early, very much involved. She came up through Chicago, and she became Bugsy Siegel's girlfriend. And Bugsy, the movie, glamorized that portion of her life. So she was certainly very heavily involved. The wives of outfit members were not part of the life at all. They were not privy to what's going on. They didn't know. And a lot of outfit guys were really stand-up family men. Tony Accardo, for example, was never even accused of being unfaithful to his wife. And when you consider the lifestyle that he lived in, that's incredible.
Yeah.
So some of them were really wonderful. I know many children and grandchildren of these people who have wonderful memories of Grandpa being Grandpa. And this other side of him they never saw.
I find that so interesting because on one hand, they seem to be these moral figures that hold themselves to some sort of code or standard, right? Like with Tony Accardo there in that example. But at the same time, you know, they'll be willing to cross other lines very easily, very violent lines, you know, where they're willing to do whatever it takes for the money, for the power, whatever the case is. I just find that so interesting how they always had that, you know, dichotomy where it was, I guess, subjective to each person, right? How they wanted to go about it and live their life. Because I'm sure there's probably other members that maybe weren't so celibate to their partners and, you know, they would do other things. But I always find that so interesting that each person was kind of had their own unique code within the umbrella.
I agree
outfit.
completely. The duality of that is really amazing. When you think about these people that come home to their wives and children, go to baseball games. I can think of a particular member, Willie the Beast Messino, who was one of the most feared outfit gangsters ever. But he spent his last 20 years of life taking his grandkids to baseball games and being their grandfather. That was his life. And there were many examples like that. Now, of course, not all of them were like that, but many of them had that duality where I would run into them in court and they would be very cordial to me, very friendly. We could have a very nice conversation. And then I would hear the testimony an hour later of what they had done to somebody with a cattle prod. Yeah. So yeah, that's it's a mystery for sure.
On that note, what was one of the most memorable moments that you had with those cases that you were a part of for the prosecutor, or you were, I think, the trial judge clerk, right? I believe.
Yes.
What was one of the most memorable experiences that you'll never forget?
That's an easy one. Sam Carlisi was the boss of the outfit, making him, in my opinion, the most powerful criminal in the United States. When he was indicted, they did it by getting a turncoat by the name of Lenny Patrick, who was a Jewish gangster, but very powerful in the outfit. Very powerful. They got him on a wire, and he was 78 years old, so he knew that if he didn't cooperate, that he was going to spend the rest of his life in prison. And throughout his testimony, he admitted to killing 7 different people. So we talked on another interview about how do you balance that? How can you use people who do these things as witnesses? Well, Lenny Patrick was like a cornered rat. And not to overuse the word rat, but you could see it in his eyes that he knew that if he didn't give the government what he wanted, he was never going to see the light of day again. And the outfit blew up his daughter's car. I mean, there was all kinds of stuff going on. So one of the most important things in any trial is there are certain rules about what you can say in front of the jury and what you can't say in front of the jury.
Okay.
And in mafia cases, outfit cases, the question is not whether this person is a member of the outfit or a member of the mafia. The question is, did they commit the crimes that they're being charged with? So the judge always instructs the witnesses, you can't use the word outfit, you can't use the word mob, you can't use the word mafia. That's prejudicial.
Yeah.
So Lenny Patrick was told all this, and he knew this. So he was talking about how Sam Carlisi had told him to bomb a movie theater in Oak Forest or Oak Park.
Okay.
And he was talking about that, and the prosecutor said to him, now why in the world, because Sam Carlisi told you to do this, why would you do it? Well, Lenny Patrick's eyes started to gleam. All 17 defense attorneys stood up before he even opened his mouth, and Lenny Patrick grabbed the microphone and held it to his mouth and shouted at the top of his lungs, because he's the boss of the mob! And it was pandemonium. And of course, the jury, then the light went on. Oh yeah, all these guys, their name ends with a vowel. They're accused of all these things. He's the boss of the mob. And that was the turning point of that trial. And of course, the judge was furious and,
Yeah.
called everybody up and told the jury to disregard what Mr. Patrick has just said. You must not consider it at all in your deliberations, but you can't unring that bell.
I was going to ask you that in our other episode, but we ran out of time. So in those situations where the judge will say, I order the jury to disregard that testimony or whatever the case may be, and then you'll see a lawyer, like we see this in Hollywood again, so that's why I want to ask you, you'll see then the lawyer who brought forth the evidence that was then dismissed or told don't pay any regard to it, they'll smirk and they'll say the damage has been done.
Right.
Is there truth to that?
There's a lot of truth to that. As a matter of fact, one of the most important things about being a good defense attorney is knowing when to just shut up. And sometimes things are said that shouldn't be said, but if you object to it, then all of a sudden the jury is being drawn back to it. The attention is being drawn back to it. And if the judge rules on it, their attention is being drawn back to it. So the bell was rung once, and now let's ring it 5 or 6 times to make sure they never forget it. So very often, I will choose to say nothing, not to move, not to react, and to completely ignore it, because it just makes it worse.
Wow, that's a crazy time to have been in that courtroom.
Yeah, it was
Experiencing that.
pandemonium for sure.
Why were they instructed not to use those words? But I would assume from thinking about it, it's because at the end of the day, it's not a crime to be, let's say, it's not criminal to be a part of the mafia. The crime is whatever the crime is.
Right.
Is that why they don't want to have any negative connotations that can disrupt the ability of the jurors to then make a decision?
That's exactly right.
Is that what it is?
They want the jurors to decide based on the facts. Did they commit predicate crime A, B, C, D? Not are they a member of the Chicago outfit?
Right. Okay.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Paul Ricca, you mentioned before, he was murdered. He was killed by somebody.
No, Paul Ricca died of old age.
He also died of old age.
He did.
Chicago had it good. These guys.
Yes, he was probably just as powerful, if not more, than Tony Accardo, but he had a lot of trouble with the law. The government was always trying to deport him. He was sent to prison for income tax evasion. He was sent to prison in the Hollywood extortion trial. So he was on parole a lot or in trouble with the INS. So he had to keep a very low profile. He could not be seen associating with known criminals. And so he was always in the background, always giving advice quietly.
Right.
Kind of behind the scenes and
Yes.
making sure people are doing what he's asking for them to do. And yeah, that makes sense.
Yes.
Do you guys did you have anyone, I don't want to say you guys, but did the Chicago outfit have members that became larger than life and that kind of fed their ego and their heads got bigger and then they became flashy? They wanted to be in the public eye and they wanted to have the nice cars and the fur coats and the women and all that?
At least 2 come to mind. Of course, the first being Al Capone.
Yes.
And Al Capone flaunted it so badly that the federal government finally said, get this guy. He's making us all look like idiots. And the fur coats and the pinky rings and the diamond belt buckles. And he was the largest cultural figure of the late 1920s. Without a doubt, the most famous person in the world. And that was what led to his downfall. And we've discussed this before. He once got off an elevator and Hoover, the president of the United States, was there. Nobody paid attention to Hoover. They all went to Capone. And of course, that made Hoover extremely upset and set in motion eventually his downfall. And the second one was Sam Giancana. This guy, I mean, he dated Phyllis McGuire of the McGuire Sisters, one of the most popular singing acts of the early 60s. He ran all over the world with her. He dated Marilyn Monroe. He loved the publicity. He loved being a gangster. The Goodfellas, you know how it starts. All my life, I just wanted to be a gangster. Yeah. Well, that was Sam Giancana. And the people that really ran things, Paul Ricca, Tony Accardo, seethed about that. They didn't think it was good for business. And eventually,
Sam was murdered.
Yes.
Yeah, Sam was murdered. But I was reading up on Sam's life, and apparently he was one of the biggest proponents as to getting those political connections in greasing people off. Like that was one of the biggest roles he played. Is it true to that?
Absolutely. Sam was a big earner. He made a lot of money for the outfit. He was a psychopathic killer, but those kind of things are overlooked in organized crime if you make a lot of money, because that's really what organized crime is about, is money and power. And Sam excelled at both of those things.
Yeah, the interesting thing about Sam's story was, I remember you guys were talking about it once, how he went into prison and he figured out that system of, well, it's not really, it's a lottery pretty much. It's the modern day lottery. Can you just talk a little bit about that story? Because I found it so fascinating about how, how it came about and how he kind of took advantage of, I can't remember that gentleman's name that he met in prison, but
Sure.
yeah, please go for it. Yeah, that's a really good story.
Sam was doing another bid in U.S. prison in Terre Haute, Indiana, and he met a guy by the name of Eddie Jones, who was the policy king of Chicago. And policy is just essentially a lottery. You pick 7 numbers, and you pay a nickel. And no one's sure why they call it policy, but they think it was because the wives were telling their husbands that they were paying the life insurance policy when they were really playing the numbers.
Got you.
And in prison, Eddie Jones befriended Sam Giancana, and they became close. He started telling him about how lucrative the policy was. And Sam learned. He was a very smart man. He listened to all this, and when he got out of prison, he went to Tony Accardo and said, listen, Tony, I would like your permission to take this over for the outfit because the money to be made is incredible. And there was a violent war. This is how Sam Giancana repaid his friend Eddie Jones by taking the policy operation from him, exiling him. They kidnapped him, actually, and kept him in Sam Giancana's basement in Oak Park, and eventually gave him $200,000 and said, get the hell out of town. And Eddie Jones was one of the few that was smart enough to do that very thing. Several of the other policy wheel runners were killed by Giancana and his men, and the outfit took it over.
Wow. And I guess that extra source of income further helped them when it came to greasing, certain people and, getting certain people in power on their side. And
yes.
Yeah, kind of just kept it going.
And it ingratiated him with Tony Accardo, because Accardo was a compulsive gambler. He said, if I die at the tables, I'll die a happy man. And all this money that was being brought in nickels and dimes, which added up to millions and millions of dollars, really made Accardo respect Giancana's abilities.
And at that time, it was millions of dollars. At that time, I think this was was this in the 40s, 50s?
Yes.
Adjusting for inflation, you're talking hundreds of millions of dollars probably in today's money.
Without a doubt.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Do you ever think about how a lot of industries that exist today, such as legalized gambling,
Yes.
legalized, or I should say decriminalized drugs, especially in Canada. Do you ever think about, like, we prosecuted people for these things, and like the government just taxed it, and now they're doing it?
It's not only me that thinks of that. If you talk to people who were active outfit members, they'll say the government's taken over all our business. Yeah. The lottery, the legalized gambling, marijuana, payday loan places. Yeah. All of the businesses that the outfit used to specialize in are now legitimized, and the government is the one that's running them. So absolutely right. Not that there still isn't room for organized crime. There are still a lot of people who can't gamble legally for various reasons, or can't get a payday loan or whatever it may be. But organized crime has been forced largely into legitimate businesses by the government taking over the nefarious things they used to do.
So what does that say about our government, or the government in general? Are they good for us? Are they bad for us? It's very hard to draw that distinct line, right?
It sure is. The government is far too complex a topic to say they're good or they're bad. Yeah. If we didn't have the social compact, in other words, that agreement that we all have together, that we're going to live by certain rules and respect personal property, personal freedom, it'd be total chaos. So there has to be something. Has it gotten too big, too powerful, too unaccountable? I think everyone would agree with that.
Yeah. I think the more we shift away from God in our societies, I feel like the more power the government gets, because if the government doesn't look up to a moral being like God, then they feel like they are the superior one in charge because they're the ones that can create laws and things like that. So I personally think it's a slippery slope when, we start to remove God out of our society, where we believe we get our morality from God. What's your thoughts on morality, especially when it comes to law and order and those kinds of things? Do you think it's important to have God in our society, or do you feel like it doesn't really make a difference?
What a great question. I've often thought that we're in the process of replacing faith with a secular religion where lawyers are the priests and judges are the high priests, and we worship the law or whatever it might be at the moment, but without some basis for that. If we really are nothing but animals, who are you to say that what I'm doing is wrong? Who am I to say what you are doing is wrong? In history, if we look back at society who have lost their fundamental beliefs, what follows is collapse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Demoralization of society comes. Yeah. And once you demoralize society, like people, they won't be sensitive to the truth anymore. They'll be desensitized. So it's actually, a lot of it goes back to, well, obviously thousands of years of history, but even communist doctrine. Like there was a Russian doctor who came to the States. Was he a doctor or he just had his PhD? And he came to the States and he was talking about this. He's like, the second you it's part of the communist agenda. Yes. Second, you demoralize society, especially sexually. Mm-hmm. Sexually, like you expose children and all that. Members of society won't be able to make a proper choice or decision between right or wrong, even if you present them with the facts. Because at that point, as you just said, who's to say what's right or wrong? You can't tell me what to do. Everyone does what's right in their own eyes.
Well, and that is actually one of the fundamental tenets of witchcraft is do no harm to others. Do as you will, but don't harm anyone else. Yeah. That's a mechanism for chaos.
Because how do you determine who you're harming?
Well, right.
Sometimes there's you might say a little white lie, but all of a sudden it had other consequences somewhere else. We don't know. We don't see the full picture, as we were talking about.
Right.
Well, guys, look at Nazi Germany, right? Laws were passed. Laws were put in place that allowed that leader to do what he had to do according to his own agenda, according to what he thought was right.
Yeah.
Right? In terms of eliminating certain groups of people, right? It was just his perspective. If there is no, God, if there is no higher being, it's just he thought that was the right thing to do. So who would we be to judge him and say, that's wrong? That's why I think we have to have that superior higher power to give us those laws. Otherwise, laws can get passed easily.
The most powerful story that goes along exactly with what you've just said is I had a dear friend that I went to church with who grew up in Nazi Germany. And she said that after Hitler came to power, they're all sitting in Sunday school, and the SS came into the Sunday school room and shot the Sunday school teacher in the head in front of all the students, took down the picture of Jesus from the wall, and put up a picture of Hitler and says, "This is now Hitler Youth."
Wow.
The first two laws that Hitler passed, you know what they are?
I can't remember them now.
He banned interest for various reasons. That was keeping Germany poor, or the Germans people poor. And the second thing was I don't know which order they were in, but the first two is they got rid of like brothels and the underground like bars or clubs or whatever, just to kind of clean up society. And then Germany became a leading world empire, like a economy, because after World War I, they were responsible to repay or pay back all the countries for the war.
Yeah.
So they were dirt poor, but then they rose in power. And so sometimes the devil disguises himself
as an angel of light.
As an angel of light in sheep's clothing, right? And something that it boomed. People were happy. People were doing well. Then all of a sudden, you just shared a quick little story. Imagine that happened in a school today. Here. You're going to worship Trump. You're going to worship Biden.
Right. Right, and the depth of evil is unimaginable. But this lady, even though she lived through that, she would say things like, well, Hitler loved dogs and children. He wasn't all bad.
Wow.
So even after what she witnessed, and the complexity of it is illustrated by another story where she said that she was walking across a field towards the end of the war and a British Spitfire was strafing her and kept coming back and trying to kill her. And here she's this 12-year-old girl just walking by, and a British fighter pilot was trying to kill her just because she was a German.
Wow.
So questions of good and evil are not always as easy as we wish that they were.
Yeah. Well, Paul, what happens when the government passes laws that go against what you fundamentally believe in? Let's say in terms of what your religion is, what your belief is. How does somebody work through that where you want to follow the laws of the land and be a good upstanding citizen, but at the same time it goes against what you believe as, let's say, for example, I'm a Christian, right? How would you go about that? I'm curious to hear how your mind processes that.
That's such a tough question because I can't think of a perfect example of how that could happen. I would be prayerfully, I would say I hope that never happens to that degree.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of people would say it's already happened and is happening the world over. And at that point, I think each individual has to make a choice. What do I do? And we've seen people who have refused to follow the laws that they felt contradicted their personal beliefs, and the results have been mixed. Sometimes they were found had violated the law, and other times the went to the Supreme Court and they said, I'm sorry, but the freedom of religion is fundamental to our First Amendment. And that can also be a slippery slope, because what if somebody says, well, my religion is cannibalism, or something like that. We can't allow that either.
Exactly.
So it's a very difficult thing to govern a country of hundreds of millions of people with diverse beliefs. It's very hard. And when the world has changed so much from when we broke away from Great Britain because they wouldn't let us worship as we wanted to.
Yeah, that's interesting.
It's a very, very interesting time. And, this is the year where most of the world is going through elections.
Yeah.
America's going through one. I would say we are going through one, but I'm Canadian. For our audience who doesn't know that, we're Canada, from Canada. But we could go through an election at any time. They could call it. So it's going to happen next year for sure, unless it happens earlier. But you look at it, you're working in the area of law, and you see what's going on with society, constantly divide and conquer, pick a side, pick a side, pick a side. Do you think we're at the point now where there's all these talks, civil war and all this, but do you think we're at the point where you got to pick a side? Or do we need to come back in the middle?
Well, in order to pick a side, there has to be a legitimate choice. And now, just as we were sitting here discussing it a couple of hours ago, we learned that President Biden has withdrawn from the election. So we don't know what choices we're going to have. But I guess my overarching feeling about this is genuine sadness for our country, that the people that we had until 2 hours ago were truly the best that our country could produce. I have a lot of concerns about both those people, and it makes me think that there's something sick in our system that we have to choose between someone who is, for whatever your feelings are, convicted of all these felony crimes and been convicted of sexual assault and all these other things, or someone who was probably not fully aware of what was going on around them. Yeah. Is that really the best we can do as the United States of America? That's what really concerns me, even more than what's the result going to be in November. Is there something wrong with our system that this is the choice we're presented with?
Yeah, and now all these years of stuff that was done, work that was done, now this person's not running again.
Right.
So there's no accountability there, because the people would have voted for that. Because one of the Trump's thing is that 4 years of how I ran things, 4 years of how he ran things, you pick. Right. The American people, you pick.
Right.
Now, how do you pick now?
Well, I guess first we have to figure out who we're going to pick between. I don't know who the Democratic nominee is going to be. But with Trump, you know what he did. And if you like what he did, then you can vote for him. I don't know who the other person is going to be or what their record is going to be. None of us do. The whole country is holding its breath, waiting to figure out where is this going to go. And then when you throw in the fact that someone takes a shot at Trump, an 18-year-old kid was able to penetrate the security and take a shot at him from a very obvious vantage point, where even people in the crowd were saying, hey, that guy, he's up on the roof, something's got to be done. What is going on in our country?
Yeah. There has to be a lot of investigations, and I think a lot of people need to be held accountable, because otherwise the same thing could just happen again.
And the scariest part of it is, if you're the leader of China, North Korea, Iran, the Russian Federation, you've got to be saying to yourselves, they're in a lot of trouble, they're distracted, their leader is sick, now's the time for me to act.
That's the scary part.
Yeah.
That's the scary part. Yeah. The world is changing. The world has changed. It's changing before our eyes, and usually before the next frontier is put in place, there's conflict.
And that's so scary. And one thing that Donald Trump said a lot of things that I just can't get behind, but one thing about him is that nobody messed around when Trump was president because they didn't know what he's going to do. North Korea, Russia, China, they all behaved because what in the world is this man going to do? Look at the kinds of things he's said. Now, I'm not saying that's necessarily a great thing, but look at what's happened in the last 3.5 years. Look what happened in Israel. Look what happened in Ukraine. The Chinese are spreading out all over the world, and these things are not in our interest. So I'm not blaming Joe Biden, but I'm saying that American influence is definitely at risk.
Yeah, definitely. I think so too. Well,
onto like just a little more positive. Like I want to end off, I should say, on a positive note. What message do you have, not only for Americans, but for people in general listening to this?
I think that, and not to go back to Trump, but I think if Trump had given a speech at the convention that truly unified people, it would have done a lot of healing. We've got to stop attacking each other. We've got to stop all this overemphasizing and using terribly strong words about people being a threat to democracy and the end of our country. And we have to remember we are all Americans, North Americans.
That's right.
And love and fraternity and generosity and gentleness and grace. We've forgotten all those things. And until we get them back, we're going to keep sliding down and down and down. We have to return to those fundamental values.
I agree. I think we all have to unite together just for the greater good, not because of one side or the other side, just for the greater good of, your country, our country, and for the betterment of people in general.
Absolutely right.
Yeah.
We've turned on ourselves. In the West, not just in the United States,
Yeah,
but in the West, we've turned on ourselves. And you see it in Canada, too.
Oh, big time.
Yeah. Lots of
We
separation.
go to California and we're like, this is great. That should say enough about where we are living. I'm dead serious. When we went to Irvine, now Irvine's a really nice place, like in all of America. But my wife and I, we were loving it. This was like amazing. And I'm like, babe, you know how people are leaving California? She's like, really? I'm like, yeah, people are leaving California. But that's how bad, not how bad we have. I shouldn't say that. Bombs are not flying over us.
Right.
We're safe to an extent. A lot of crime now, but that's happening a lot of places. But it's difficult. The lifestyle is difficult.
Yeah.
Raising a family is difficult. Buying a home is difficult. These are challenges that they're not just unique to Canada, but they're really exaggerated in Canada right now. And it's been 9 years of the same leadership. You guys have terms, right? Mm-hmm. We don't have those terms.
Right.
So sometimes there just needs to be a change just for the morale of people to be like, okay, better days are ahead.
And that's what just happened in Britain. They'd had enough of the party that was in power, regardless of who they were, 14 years, and they threw them out. They said it's time for change. And I think that a lot of the angst that you see in your country and our country is we are just sick of political leaders lying,
Yep.
hiding things, pursuing their own personal goals at the expense of the people. Yep. We're all just sick of it, and we need a change.
They're elected by us,
Right.
for us.
Right.
So you got to serve. That's the idea. But as we said, a lot of people, when they get that power, it goes to their head. You don't know what somebody's true intentions are. You can only watch what they do.
And here in North America, we truly are, I truly believe this, the greatest example of freedom and prosperity that's ever existed. And we have to treat that as the precious thing that it is.
Where else are you going to go?
Right.
Where else are you going to go and live this way?
Nowhere.
Nowhere. It doesn't exist.
No.
This was the greatest. People have thousands of years worked towards something like this. And we have it.
Right. No one's kicking the door down to get into China.
No one's plotting and scheming to get into China or Russia. Not to knock on them. I wish it was the case where we had that option. I really do.
Right.
But listen, you have that option. If you want to live like that, go ahead. But I'd rather be free. I'd rather not be spied on. And I know to an extent it happens, but hopefully it's in the interest of public safety and security, and they're not paying attention to my conversations with my wife.
Unless you say certain key words.
Yeah.
Well, have you noticed that if you talk to your wife about, well, I'm thinking that maybe you should buy this product, and then you open your Facebook,
all
and
over.
every ad is for that
That's,
product.
that's why I'm like, Jesus Christ, Jesus Christ, Jesus Christ. Give me more. Paul,
It's been a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure, honestly. I'm sad it's over.
It has really been fun talking to you guys.
Likewise, we appreciate your time, and if you're ever in Toronto, please let us know. Love to take you out and do this again.
You got a place to stay with us if you want.
Thank you very much, guys.
Appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
Guys, thank you so much for watching. If you guys watch till the end, you guys are the best. We appreciate you so much. Guys, make sure to hit that like and that comment, that subscribe button. We appreciate you so much. And until next time, guys, we're out.
We're out.